Okay, so today we're going to talk about the second part of speech in the 8 parts of speech. And yesterday, hopefully, you watched the video on nouns. And if you recall, the definition for a noun is any kind of word that names people, places, things, or ideas. The good news for you for the second part of speech is that if you can fully understand nouns, then you should be able to also identify pronouns. Because you can see noun right in the word pronoun. It's an easy way to remember it. Pronouns simply take the place of one or more nouns. And we'll talk about why in a minute. So if you recall when we talked about nouns, we not only gave the definition, we talked about how they function in a sentence. And I went on in a lot of detail about some different options for the kinds of functions nouns might perform. Anywhere from subjects, direct objects, indirect objects, and lastly, objects of prepositions. Now, the good news for you is that because pronouns, replace nouns, they do the same jobs in sentences, meaning they perform the same functions. So where you would see a noun in a sentence, you would also see a pronoun. They function as subjects, direct objects, indirect objects, and objects of prepositions. There are other examples, but those are the main ones, and they're the ones we're going to focus on. So when we look at pronouns and understand them, seeing that they perform the same functions as nouns should help you understand them. Let's take a look at some examples of pronouns, and you'll see what I mean by taking the place of nouns. Some examples include I, you, me, they, who, which, and yourself, to name a few of many. There are far too many for us to list. And there are all sorts of kinds of pronouns, from personal pronouns that take the place of people, to reflexive pronouns, to words that start questions, interrogative pronouns, to relative pronouns. So with all these different kinds of pronouns, it can get really confusing. The good news is I'm not asking you to remember all the different kinds of pronouns. I want you to focus again on how they function. Okay? So if you take a look at our first example, John said hello to Sally when he sat at the table. The bolded word he is a pronoun. We'll start right there. Hopefully, if you take a look at the definition, you'll realize that he is replacing somebody who was already stated in that sentence. By now, you should be thinking, well, there's only 2 people in that sentence. He is not referring to Sally. Sally's a girl. So he's referring to the subject of the sentence, John. Okay? When we say they take the place of nouns, what we're saying is he is taking the place of John in the second clause in the sentence. There is no need to repeat John every time you mention John's name in the context of your writing. Imagine if we didn't use pronouns, how absurd your writing would sound. We would have to say something like, John said hello to Sally when John sat at the table. Well, what's the point of always repeating people's specific names when we know who we're referring to? So that's why pronouns become important. They replace nouns so that we're not just repeating those nouns again and again in our writing. Okay? Now, one thing I do want you to know is there's a technical term for the word that a pronoun replaces, and that word is an antecedent. Now, antecedent literally means something that comes before. And that's really what John is doing in this sentence. If you think about it, John comes before he. It's established that the person that we're speaking about in this sentence is John, and he is simply referring back to John. And we would say he is the pronoun to its antecedent, John. Now, if you recall what we said about functions from the noun video, we said the subject is the word that the sentence is about, or more specifically, what the independent clause is about. And if we take a look at halfway through the first example, when he sat at the table, that's what's called an independent clause. It had, or not independent, excuse me, a clause. It's actually a dependent clause. We'll talk about that a little later. But if you take a look at the clause, it has its own subject, what the clause is about. And the clause is about he. So he, the pronoun, is functioning as a subject, just like a noun would, just like John does in the first half of that sentence, in the first clause. Okay? Let's take a look at the second example. Betty, stop looking at yourself in the mirror. The bolded word yourself refers to another noun in the sentence, and in this case, another person. And you can probably guess who that person is. It's Betty. So Betty is the antecedent of the reflexive pronoun, to be technical, yourself. Okay? If we take a look at the third example, sometimes these antecedents, the words that the pronouns are referring back to, the words more specifically that they're taking the place of, they're not actually in the sentence themselves. And usually, you can find them in sentences around that specific sentence in the context of the paragraph, okay? So if we had a paragraph that started, Fred looked nervous before taking the test, period, end of thought. New sentence, he hadn't studied for it. Now the pronouns he and it that are bolded are pronouns that refer back to nouns that were in the previous sentence, and that oftentimes happens. They are still considered pronouns, and they still have antecedents. It's just that those words that they're replacing aren't directly in the specific sentence. So you can probably figure out that he refers to what noun? Fred. The antecedent is Fred. Fred hadn't studied for it. Let's take a look at it. It is another noun or pronoun replacing a noun. What was the thing that he was nervous about? The thing that he hadn't studied for? You guessed it. Test. Test is the antecedent to it. There are oftentimes examples when pronouns will not have antecedents at all around them because they're understood in the conversation or context of the writing. So if you were having a conversation with your friend and you sat around and said, hey, would you like to go with me to the beach? You and me are both pronouns replacing people. It's only that in the context of the conversation or the writing, you might not see those names, those antecedents. It's understood that if I ask my friend, would you like to go with me to the beach? The you I'm speaking about is that specific friend that I'm addressing. And the me is myself. So these are the way pronouns function in the sentence. These are the way they operate. They take the place of nouns. And because we already talked about how nouns function as subjects, indirect objects, direct objects, and objects of prepositions, we should be able to see these pronouns fitting in those same roles. So if I take a look at Fred looked nervous before taking the test, he hadn't studied for it. He hadn't studied for it is the subject because he is what the sentence is about, if you recall from the previous video. And he studied for it. Well, for it is what we would call a prepositional phrase. For being the preposition, and that makes it the object of a preposition. So in all of these examples, we can see that they're functioning just like nouns would in sentences, and that makes sense because they're taking the place of nouns. Hopefully this is helpful to you, and if you need more explanation or further detail on the different kinds of pronouns or the way they operate within the context of a sentence, you can click on the next link in the learning module that'll take you to grammarrevolution.com, and you can read up more. There's also a little check afterwards that you can take to see how well you've grasped this concept. Thanks for watching.